We're very excited this evening to be in the presence of Maggie O'Farrell, whose Hamnet, right here, was one of my favourite books of last year. In fact, my favourite book of last year, and many, many people's favourite book of last year. This is an event as part of BBC Novels That Shaped Our World's Libraries programme. And this is a partnership between Derbyshire Council and Derbyshire Libraries and Libraries Connected. Maggie, it's lovely to have you here.
It's lovely to be here. Well, it's virtually here. Thank you for having me.
Do you find it quite odd that, like, you're literally in people's houses, as it were, and they're also in yours in this new sort of world that we find ourselves in?
It is, but you know, I mean, to be honest, it's probably one of the least strange things of the last year and a bit, isn't it? I mean, we've all had such steep learning curves and such weird things have happened and things we never thought would happen. And so, yeah, it seems actually, you know, the thin end of the wedge, actually, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And actually, Hamnet, unintentionally, was a very apt novel for the last year. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the premise for those who may not know, and also if you would be up for doing a little reading.
Yeah. So Hamnet is about it's the story of Shakespeare's only son, who's called Hamnet, and the novel is about his very short life because he died at the age of 11, and Shakespeare went on for about 4 or 5 years later, possibly, to write the play Hamlet. And in those days, the names were exactly the same. They are interchangeable in Paris records because spelling was a lot less stable in the 16th century. So I've always been really intrigued by the act of Shakespeare calling probably his most famous play, I think it's his most perfect play, after his dead son. And it's strange, you know, I first heard about Hamlet, Shakespeare the boy, when I was at school and I was 16 and I was studying the play Hamlet. And the play really got under my skin in a way that other plays haven't actually. And I just was very struck by this idea. And it's always seemed to me that Shakespeare is such a mysterious person. You know, we have an enormous wealth of his plays and poetry, and we feel as though we know him very well, but actually him, the person, the man, is pretty mysterious. You know, there are so many gaps in his story, so many mysteries surrounding him, so many, I mean, you know, scholars talk about the lost years, which refer to the time when he was basically, we know he was at high school, grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon until he was 15 or 16. But then we know he got married at 18. But between that and him appearing on the London stage, nobody can trace that journey despite the best efforts of the best scholars for the last 400 odd years. No one has ever been able to work out how that happened and why that happened. So his you know, he is quite mysterious and quite shadowy, but it's always seemed to me that in the act of calling this play and his protagonist, and let's not forget a ghost, after his deceased son, he briefly becomes visible to us as a human being and as a grieving father and as a heartbroken man. You know, he becomes a human being rather than this sort of literary icon that we all know and love. So it's just always intrigued me, and I wanted to, but I feel Hamnet, the boy, has been really ignored by history and by scholarship. You know, I feel as though he's been just relegated to a tiny footnote in his father's biography. You know, he's lucky in these huge works of scholarship, these biographies, if Hamnet gets maybe 2 mentions. You know, they mention he was born, they mention he died, and they always wrap up his death in statistics about child mortality in the 16th century, almost as if the implication is that it wasn't really that big of a deal because lots of children died. And, you know, I just refuse to believe that at any point in history, anywhere in the world, it's anything other than devastating to lose a child. I just don't believe it. So I wanted to write this novel. So this is a really long answer to your question. I wanted to write this novel to give him a voice and a presence, you know, to say this boy was significant. His life was short, but it's hugely significant. You know, I don't think without him and without his very early and tragic death, we would have Hamlet, and I don't think we would have Twelfth Night. So anyway, sorry, that was I could rant on about this. When I was writing the book, my children limited me to 1 Tudor fact a day. I was only allowed to say 1. Any more than that. They said, no, you've had it 1 today. And you can see why, actually, if you start me off on it. So I'm going to read a part from right at the beginning of the book, when Hamnet is running about the house where he lives in Henley Street in Stratford, and he's looking for someone because his twin sister Judith has fallen ill. and he's come across his grandfather in what he thinks was a deserted house. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something. Papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. There is a pitcher on the table and a cup. His grandfather's hand meanders through these objects, his head bent, his breath coming in wheezing bursts. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arms flailing through the air as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cried. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell and—" "They've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women anyway?" He seizes the neck of the pitcher and aims it towards the cup. The liquid, ale, Hamnet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse and then dab at them with his sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamnet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamnet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gawping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamnet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he's in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stay well back. Do you hear? His father had said this to him on his last visit, when they had been helping unload a cart from the tannery. John, his grandfather, had dropped a bundle of skins into the mud and in a sudden fit of temper had hurled a paring knife at the yard wall. His father had immediately pulled Hamnet back behind him out of the way, but John had barged past them into the house without a word. His father had taken Hamnet's face in both of his hands, fingers curled in at the nape of his neck, his gaze steady and searching. "He'll not touch your sisters, but it's you I worry for," he had muttered, his brow puckering. "You know the humour I mean, don't you?" "Swear to me," his father had said as they stood in the yard. "Swear it. I need to know you'll be safe when I'm not here to see to it." Hamnet believes he is keeping his word. He is well back. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamnet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this." His grandfather holds out another paper. Hamnet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Everything happens so fast that afterwards Hamnet won't be sure in what sequence it all occurred. The page swings to the floor between them. His grandfather's hand seizes him by the wrist, by the elbow, hauling him forwards into the gap, the necessary space his father had told him to observe, and his other hand, which still holds the cup, is coming up fast. Hamnet is aware of streaks in his vision, red, orange, the colours of fire, before he feels the pain. It is a sharp, clubbed, jabbing pain. The rim of the cup has struck him just below the eyebrow. "That'll teach you," his grandfather is saying in a calm voice, "to creep up on people. Thank you."
Thank you very much, Maggie. And I should say that me and Maggie will have a chat for about 20 minutes and then we will hand over to your questions, which I can see in the chat box are already coming through, actually, which is very exciting. We like it when people are keen. So now, you mentioned that you wanted to give voice to Hamnet. Why was it at this point in your career that you decided to write this story?
Well, I mean, I should probably first say that I always think the word career, when connected with a writer, is a bit laughable, really. I think that if anyone, I never think of it as a career. I always think that's really weird. My career ended in 2000 when I left my proper job, my proper office job. I can't think anyone who wants to write for a living is really not interested in a career at all. But it was, I mean, it has been a book I wanted to write for a really long time. And I think, I don't know, I mean, there were a few things that sort of kept throwing spanners in my works, actually. One of the main things that stopped me was that I have a son and 2 daughters, just like the Shakespeares did. Although actually they're in a different order. My son's the eldest. But I just knew that if I was going to write this book, I knew that I was going to have to put myself inside the head of a woman who, I mean, it's not a spoiler to say she's forced to sit by the bedside of her son and has to watch him die, and then she needs to lay him out for burial. And I'm not really a superstitious person, but I was quite superstitious about writing that before my own son was past the age of 11. So it's funny, the other day I was looking through a notebook I have where I write ideas. So even if it's just a really small idea, I just scroll it down, and it's a very messy notebook, but I've had it for years. And I was just flicking through it, and I noticed that in 2011, I had written this thing saying, novel about Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, with a question mark. And I'd actually drawn brackets around it, which meant, maybe I should pursue that idea. So that's 10 years ago. And my son was 8 at that point. Is that right? Yes, he was 8. So I kept thinking about it, and I would make I would make a foray, I would do a bit of research, and I would order some more books about Shakespeare, and I'd add them to my Hamnet shelf, and then I would sort of shy away. I mean, I think actually I've written 3 other books instead of writing Hamnet, but there was just something, I don't know what it is. It's, and in some ways I think I'm probably the worst person to ask, because I tend not to analyze what it is I'm doing or why I'm doing it. I always feel that it's not really me who chooses the books, they choose me in a sense. But there was just something about the planets being aligned and my son being past the crucial age. He's now a 6'17" so I think, not that there was a huge risk of him contracting Black Death, but you never know, you can't be too careful. So and after I finished, because I wrote, before I wrote Hamnet, I wrote a memoir, and I do remember after I finished that, I sort of sat myself down and gave myself a talking to, and I said, you either got to write this book or you've got to forget about it. You can't keep circling around it and buying yet more books about Shakespeare in the 16th century. You just got to give it a shot. You've got to give it a go. And I don't know what it is. There was just something about that point in my life. The planets seemed aligned. And I also realized I opened up the document where I'd started the book, and I'd written about probably 15,000 words, maybe 20,000. And I realized I'd started it in completely the wrong place, I'd sort of started at the end of the story, and I was going to go into flashback. So I just ditched all that, and I started again with the boy. I wanted to put Hamnet centre stage, and just, I don't know what it was. It was like a key turning in the lock. It just felt like the right time.
That's really interesting. So was it always kind of percolating away in the background when you were writing other novels, or was it just like this sort of, I want to say like a shimmer in the background?
Yes, I suppose I don't know, like there are always ideas that you think you might come to at some point. There are still, I've got 3 or 4 ideas that I might do next, but I don't know which one I'll go for, and I will think about them sometimes, or I'll sort of daydream about them. But I think I can't, I've heard other writers say they can write 2 books at the same time. I've never been able to do that. I only have to be, I know, I have to do one, and I have to devote myself to it. But you never know. You never know what's ahead, really. I mean, when I finished Hamnet, I thought I had 2 ideas, which I've had for quite a long time, and I thought it was going to be one of those. And I spent a while kind of thinking about both of them, and then actually I had this 3rd idea that arrived from nowhere, and I just thought, oh my God, I have to do that. So I forget about these other 2. I'm going with number 3.
Park those for 10 years. They can come back at a later date.
You never know.
Obviously, as you mentioned, Hamnet is Shakespeare's son, and it's a question that we've had from Peter and from Dawn as well, which is why did you choose not to name him in the book? Why is he always addressed to you as something else, be it father, be it husband, be it Latin teacher, etc.?
Well, I think a number of reasons, really. The first one would be, of course, that his name, I think probably more than anyone else's in the whole world, is probably more recognisable than any other. It's a name that carries such enormous significance and heft and weight. And it's so, it's impossible. I mean, I found actually, as the writer of the book, I found it impossible to write a story, a sentence saying, William Shakespeare came downstairs and had breakfast. Just instantly, as soon as you start typing it, you just feel like an Egypt, and you think, who do I think I am? And then I experimented a little bit with, well, I have to call him William. And I think, no, it sounds so presumptuous, and Will is presumptuous. And, it just all felt wrong. And so I thought, well, as the writer, if I can't stay submerged in the narrative, I cannot expect readers to, it's ridiculous. So I just thought I'll do away with it altogether, and I suppose in a sense I wanted to ask, I suppose it was a sort of symbolic act. I wanted to ask readers to sort of forget everything they think they know about him and about his life, and just, you know, open themselves up to this person who's a human, you know, who's a young man or a father or, you know, a tutor or whatever, and just I had to try and divorce him from the name. You know, I mean, the novel is about names in a sense, you know, how the sort of strange familiarity of the son's name, you know, it's almost familiar and almost isn't, and of course the name of Shakespeare's wife, I changed that in the book as well, you know, because we all know her as Anne Hathaway, even though for most of her life she was called Shakespeare. But one of the things of research I did was I read her father's will. So Richard Hathaway, her father was a yeoman, a sheep farmer, and he died a year before she married William. And in it, he left her a very generous dowry in his will, but he names her as, he refers to her as my daughter Agnes, or Agnes, it would have been pronounced then. And that was a kind of thunderbolt moment, because I thought, you know, we've been calling her by the wrong name for, you know, almost half a century. So I gave that name back to her as well. So it is, you know, in a sense that the book sort of grapples with the idea of names and what they mean to us, and how they can become disconnected from us, and how they can have this other meta life in fiction or in plays or on stage or whatever.
I absolutely love Agnes. She's one of my favourite characters I've read in years. I've told you that before, in the fact that she is the embodiment of a loving person, be it a wife, be it a mother. She's just fantastic. And also she has a slight otherness about her. And I wondered how you came up with her character, and how this sort of otherness, did it creep in, or was it already there from the start?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I suppose when I first decided to write the book, when I first thought I'd have a go at it, I originally conceived it as to be about fathers and sons, as of course the play is, and about ghosts and the sort of absence of presence, or this presence of absence in a sense. But actually, I think, you know, what often happens, or the thing that I like actually about writing novels, is that you think you're heading in one direction, and actually during the work of it, you realise that you're heading in another. But what happened was with her, that during my research, I read quite a bit about Shakespeare and also about his wife, and I was absolutely horrified at how she has been treated by history and by scholarship and biographers. You know, I mean, if we think we know little about Shakespeare, we know almost nothing about her. You know, we don't even know when she was born, because she was born before parish records began. I mean, we know that she got married. We know that 6 months after the wedding, she had a baby. We know that she had, you know, Susanna, a daughter, and then she had twins, Hamnet and Judith. And we know when she died. Not much else. There is a reference to her running a malting business later in life. But nevertheless, that hasn't stopped a lot of biographers and scholars, other novelists, writers of Oscar-winning screenplays to rush forward and fill those voids or those gaps with vilification and hatred and hostility and criticism of her. You know, we're always being fed this narrative about her, that she was this strumpet peasant woman who lured this boy genius into marriage. I've read very respected Shakespearean scholars saying she was stupid, you know, she was illiterate, she was ugly, none of which there is absolutely a shred of evidence for whatsoever. I mean, there's one portrait of her in existence, and actually she's very beautiful. She's got this very narrow face with high cheekbones. She looks very like the actress Saoirse Ronan, who I think most of us can agree is pretty far from ugly. But also, you know, I mean, the strange thing, you know, I think that for some reason we've been taught this narrative that, you know, there's this huge desire from scholarship and other writers to give Shakespeare a retrospective divorce, that we for some reason we desire him to be footloose and fancy free in London, to be free of her, free of this boring older wife who, you know, had the temerity to get pregnant. And it's just, I've never found any evidence for that. And people will always invoke, you know, the second best bed, the famous second best bed behest in the will. But if you look at the will, it is, I mean, two things: that the second best bed is an interlineation. It's squeezed in between two other lines. And actually the will, you know, so many people have said, well, you know, the second best bed behest, he doesn't show any affection for his wife. But actually there's no sign of any affection at all in any of the will. The will is a very, very dry document. I mean, the man was dying, let's not forget, probably of typhoid, which is a particularly horrible death. But you would never think that the will was written by the same man who wrote some of the best lines of love poetry in the world. And also, you know, I think the thing that Hathaway's detractors never mention is that by Jacobean law, she was automatically entitled to a third of his estate, which was a vast amount of money at that time, and the house. She could live in the house, which was a mansion, by the way, for the rest of her life, and she had a third of his estate. So this idea that she was this rejected wife chucked out on the street with just a bed is preposterous. It's it's not true at all. So I suppose I wanted to again to reinvent her, to ask readers to forget everything they think they know about the illiterate peasant woman, and open themselves up to a new sort of idea that actually maybe they did love each other. Maybe theirs was a marriage of love. Maybe they were devoted to each other to the end of his life. So at the end of Shakespeare's career, when he retired from the stage in London, he could have lived anywhere in the world. He was the equivalent of a multi-millionaire at this point. He'd made a vast amount of money on the stage, and he had invested it all very, very cannily. But he still lived in a very modest lodgings. He lived in one room in London, despite being, a very celebrated playwright and very, very, very wealthy. And every single penny he earned, he sent back to Stratford. So he bought his wife and daughters a mansion of a house a year after Hamnet died. And he bought fields and cottages and land that he leased out. So he was probably pretty well known in Stratford-upon-Avon as a landlord, actually, probably better known as a landlord than he was as a playwright. And also, so at the end of his life, when he retired, he could have lived anywhere in the world. He could have set up a household in London if that's what he wanted, but he chose to go back to Stratford to live with his wife. And that, to me, is a key detail. And I think, well, if he hated her, if he regretted his marriage, he wouldn't have done that. He could have done anything he wanted, but he didn't. He went back to her. So I just wanted to rewrite their story and have their marriage as a partnership and as a love match. But also, I was very interested in her. I was looking. I mean, had to be quite circumspect. I think we all had to be quite circumspect about reading too much of his biography in his plays. Because they are two separate things, as we all know. But at the same time, there are a lot of faithful, perceptive wives in his plays, and there's also a lot of sort of supernature. We have to remember that in the 16th century, people lived much more closely to that idea, and there was a lot more superstition. So, I was interested in the idea of prophecy. So there's an awful lot of prophecy in, say, Macbeth or Julius Caesar. And so that's where, and also plant lore. So in Hamlet, the play, Shakespeare, in that scene, particularly where the mad Ophelia hands plants to other characters, and every single plant is a cure for something she perceives in their character, a flaw in their character. But it's clear from that scene that Shakespeare really knows what he's talking about. He knows an awful lot about the contemporary uses of plants and medicines. And I just decided to give that expertise to her because I like the idea that they might have had this exchange of information.
Well, lots of people have been asking about research. And I know that one of the things you did in your research was to create a garden like Agnes would have, and also you did things like falconry and stuff. How did you get into Elizabethan, well, the landscape of Elizabethan England, as it were, I guess?
Well, I think obviously a lot of the research was library based, because there are so many books you can read about Shakespeare, and there's so much you need to know. In a sense, you need to know an awful lot before you can even begin. I found that before I could write a scene with, I don't know, two people arguing, and it happened to be in an Elizabethan parlour, I needed to know everything about the room. You need to know what the floor's made of, what the walls look like, what they're wearing, what the window is made of. But actually, you need to leave a lot of that out. So you need to find a lot of stuff from books. But I think particularly, I think to bring it to life, to sort of give it a pulse in a sense, you've got to, actually it's probably literally get your hands dirty in my case, because it's one thing to read in a book, which I did, every household would have had a medicinal garden, and the woman of the house would have known what to do to cure more minor ailments. But actually, what I needed to do was get the seeds and dig myself a garden and plant them and lay it out, and then learn about how you use these plants, how they would have been used, how you make a poultice from a comfrey leaf and you apply it to an aching joint. So I did do that, and I also learned how to fly. I learned falconry. I actually flew a kestrel, because at the beginning Agnes has her own kestrel. But you see, the point, why you need to do it is because I'd written a scene where Agnes flies the kestrel, and then I went down to the Scottish borders and I met this very cool falconer, and she let me fly a number of her birds. And when I flew the kestrel, so I'd written in my scene, I described the kestrel landing on her glove with a thud. When I actually flew a kestrel, I realised that a kestrel is about the weight and the size of a kitten. So when it lands on your glove, it sort of appears. They're so silent, which is why they're such brilliant hunters. It just appears. 1 minute it's not there, and the next minute it's there, and you don't feel it. It's totally silent. So obviously, I had to go back and rewrite the scene, because there was no thud. Castrals are very light, so that's why you need to do it. That's why you need to get your hands dirty and get stuck in.
One of the things that I love is that the book is very much you feel that you are in Elizabethan England, but it's also very contemporary in the way that it's told. Was that something that you purposefully wanted to do?
Well, I had a rule with myself, and I had there was a sort of line in the sand, and it was that I was never going to write sort of cod Elizabethan dialogue. Exactly, can you imagine? So I had a friend of mine, and she said, whatever you do, never use the word sirrah, as in, good sirrah. And so that was my kind of sirrah, and sort of prithee, my lord. None of that. I thought, no, that's my line in the sand. I'm never going to cross that. So, because obviously how could you, how could you think, I can write Shakespearean dialogue, it's no problem. I mean, how ridiculous. So I knew that it was going to be in, contemporary syntax and contemporary grammar, but I think what I really tried to do was only use, I tried to use sort of Elizabethan semantics in a sense. So I only used words, I tried anyway, to only use words that had the same meaning now as they did in the 16th century. And so the last few read-throughs of the novel I did, the manuscript, before I handed it in, I did it with the Oxford English Dictionary next to me, and I would look up words that I thought maybe this didn't mean the same thing. So my editor found one. I'd written a scene where she's in the middle of a conversation, she's pleating her dress, and I described her pleating into concertina folds, and my editor wrote, concertinas weren't invented until the 18th century, so that had to go. And I'd also used the word shambles as in a sort of context of chaos, a mess or a disaster. And I looked it up just to check it, and actually in the 16th century, shambles meant to dice up a carcass. So that had to go. So I tried to do sort of Elizabethan semantics rather than grammar and speech patterns.
And how did you, because you must have had, and like you said, your kids said that you could only have one Tudor fact a day. How did you know how much to share that you'd learned? Because one of the things that I love about the book is that I know that there's all of that world around it, but I don't feel like I'm being forcibly told everything that you knew, or being described everything, which actually the characters wouldn't pay any attention to because they were there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think firstly, I tried never to sort of be conscious of the fact that I was writing a historical novel. I tried to approach it as I would any novel, really, because I didn't want to write this sort of pastiche, and I already felt that it was, there is a kind of presumptuousness, certainly, writing about people who are real, or who were real, even though there's been, almost half a millennium in between us and them. You've got to always remember and be respectful of the fact that these people were real, so I tried never to go against a fact that I could find about them, even if it was a fact that didn't quite fit my plan for them. I tried never to just kind of think, oh, I'll just ignore that, pretend I didn't read it. But also, in a sense, I went back and reread books about the past that I really enjoyed, and I thought, well, why are these good? So one of my favorite ever, I suppose you could call it, historical novel is The Sisters Brothers by Patrick DeWitt, which is about contract killers in the Wild West, so set probably over 100 years ago. And what's brilliant about it is that it wears its history incredibly lightly. You don't really have a sense. It's very, very, very sparse on detail or historical kind of lead balloons that suddenly fall. So I realized that, you have to know, like I was saying about the Elizabethan parley, you've got to know everything about it. But I really wanted to leave out maybe 95-98% of my research. You need to know it for confidence, but actually you need to leave a lot of it out, because you don't really want a novel that reads a bit like a PhD. You don't really want your reader to be constantly reminded that you've done your homework, and constantly reminded, showing, it's that thing you always told in maths classes, show your workings. Actually, you shouldn't show your workings in a historical novel. You need to get rid of them, because I just like the idea that the history is incidental. What was important to me, or interesting to me as a novelist anyway, is the people and the story and the lives and the hearts and minds of these people, not what their cups are made from, or necessarily what the window panes look like. I mean, I need to know, but then I need to leave it out of the novel.
Well, I always think it's light switches that I notice in historical fiction get really focused on for some reason. I don't know why. I spotted it a lot.
Yeah,
it wasn't had those then. So
I did once read a book that described somebody picked up the telephone, and it mentioned that the telephone was made of Bakelite, and it was an early plastic. And I thought, what? Why are you telling me this? This is so distracting. Yeah. So any of that, nothing like that was allowed to be in there.
Now, one thing that I want to ask you about actually is the fact that obviously this is based on real people and real incidents in history, admittedly shrouded in some mystery and not that much is known. But how was it to write what had happened, and how much, as you got to know the characters more, how much responsibility did you feel towards them, I guess, in a way? But also, how do you keep the reader when they know the premise going? Because you do, it reads, it is, you can't put it down, even though like it is hard. It's about love and grief and family. How did you go about all of that, which was, I think, possibly a three-pronged question? Sorry, Maggie.
How did I go about it? Well, I mean, it was, like I said, I always tried to remember that the people were real. And although, you know, my Hamnet is an 11-year-old fictional boy, but there is somewhere in the churchyard at Stratford-upon-Avon, there are the bones of a real boy who was called Hamnet Shakespeare. We don't know where, because he doesn't have a gravestone, unfortunately. So I tried always to remember that and to remember these people were real. And I tried to never take any liberties. I think the only factual liberty I took was changing the name of one of Shakespeare's sisters, because she actually had the same name as Agnes's mother or stepmother, and it's too confusing in the novel. You can't have two Jones, you know. It's asking too much for readers. So I did change that. So what I know, and I think it is hard, you know. I think you always have to remember, but certainly not naming Shakespeare helped a huge amount, certainly with me, with creating that world. And it was only actually became tricky when I had two male characters interacting and nobody else, because then you play this ridiculous kind of pronoun game. And there's one chapter where he gets into a kind of argument and a near fight with Agnes's brother Bartholomew, and the two of them are squaring up to each other. And actually that scene is the one I think I've rewritten more times, because you have to kind of twist the grammar and force it to get around the fact that one of these characters is not going to be named. And I spent ages looking at it, just kind of driving myself insane, thinking the readers are never going to know when I thought he said or he did or he jumped or he fought. You know, I thought no one's ever going to follow this. But anyway, so it was interesting in a sort of technical way. I can't remember the third part of your question now. What was it?
It was, how do you keep the reader reading on, even though from the offset you know sort of the premise, I guess.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, I think I've always felt I think the kind of engine behind the book for me was that not enough people know about little Hamnet. You know, he's not well known enough. People don't know. You know, I studied English at Lit at university, and I asked some of my friends who also studied with me, and I said, do you know what Shakespeare's children were called? And none of them knew. And, you know, I think I've always felt he isn't well known enough. You know, he gets a really brief mention in Ulysses, but that's sort of it, really. You know, so I always you know, but I wanted people to know right from the start, there's a kind of note at the beginning saying, but I think what I know, I always knew that the death would appear about halfway through the novel, because for me, you know, I think I was so angered in a sense by the implication of biographers that Hamnet was not grieved and that he was not significant, and you know, Shakespeare just called the play because he couldn't think of another name. You know, I mean, that's mad. Anyone who reads or anyone who writes knows that you would never, ever, I mean, anyone would know actually, that you would never casually take the name of your dead child and write it again and again in a manuscript, you know, hear it spoken again and again during rehearsal, speak it yourself, you know, as you are on the stage in the early productions. Because I read somewhere that, possibly anecdotal, that Shakespeare took the role of the ghost in the original production of Hamlet, which of course was just too tempting a detail as a novelist to ignore. So I knew that the book would end with the play, because the play for me is the, you know, I wanted, in a sense, I wanted the book to be, I mean, obviously it's about grief and it's about loss, but actually it's also about art and why we make it and why we need it, you know, why we need to experience it or read it or look at it or watch it in this case. And you know, in a sense, I've always think that art is a kind of refutation to death, isn't it? It's a sort of assertion that we are still alive, and reading it is an assertion. It's an enjoyment and a fulfillment of our living. So I wanted, in a sense, the idea that Shakespeare creates this play because of his death, and because, you know, he changes. If you look at the play with the lens of the fact that his son has died, it's a really weird, you know, psychologically he replaces himself with his son. You know, the name Hamlet is split into two. It's the young prince and it's the dead ghost. And you know, Shakespeare in a sense has taken his son's place, and his son is living in his stead. which is so heartbreaking. You know, I almost can't read the play now because I find it too painful. The thing I find most almost unreadable actually in the play is the speech of the ghost, where he describes the manner of his death, and the ghost, the old Hamlet, lies down in an orchard, and his brother pours poison into his ear, and he describes this agonizing death with the poison coursing through his body, and he says it's horrible, horrible, most horrible, and he describes the agony of it. And I really hope that speech was made up, that Shakespeare plucked it from his imagination. But I have a horrible feeling that it's true and that he's describing the real Hamlet's death. You know, I think more than any of his plays, Shakespeare himself is visible briefly quite a lot in Hamlet, particularly that moment, and also in the moment where Hamlet writes a play and asks people, he's talking to the actors about how he wants them to speak it, tripping me off the tongue, you know, the play that catches the thing. And as soon as you read that scene, you think, oh my God, there he is. That's him, you know, that's him speaking to his actors saying, please be careful with my words. So, but I do think that the ghost is describing the death. And when I read that speech, I thought, well, it's the plague, isn't it? It's Black Death, poison coursing through the body. So I find that very upsetting, that speech.
Well, the book made me cry for lots of reasons, but it's very emotional as a read, and I did cry. I cried when love was written so beautifully. I cried when grief was written so honestly. I just cried at certain phrases. And actually, Steve Madison said, the writing is so evocative. Where do you find phrases like the pain rinsed down his chest, encasing his heart in a crackling frost? Where do you find those phrases, please?
I don't know, actually. I suppose you have to think very carefully. You have to choose your words carefully, and you have to think, how does it feel? How does it feel to be in pain? How does it feel to be frightened? And you've always got to avoid using phrases or words that you feel as though you might have heard before. I think that's what I always think. I was given that advice when I used to go to poetry evening classes given to me by a poet, an Irish-American poet called Michael Donaghy. And that was one of the advices he said. He said, never, ever use anything that you feel like you maybe heard before.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now, we kind of skipped off from Plague Bear, but I can't not bring it up because of obviously 2020 and now into 2021. But how has it been for you in the fact that there is a chapter in the book, which I think is some of the most incredible, I mean, the whole book is incredible, but where you describe how the plague arrives in London and we travel with it, basically. How is it, obviously writing that in your imagination and then actually seeing that happen?
That was strange. It's certainly true. You know, when I never planned that chapter, the one you're talking about. It was just something that sort of arrived as I was writing the book. At that point in the book, I felt that the book had been quite hermetic, and it had happened in this quite small market town in one or two or three houses. And I felt almost, you know, I knew that I was going to have to write about the infection arriving, and I just felt, you know, and I'd been researching the Black Death and just the statistics and the extent of it was so horrific. And the disease itself is absolutely horrific. You know, the idea that it's so virulent, and the Elizabethans had absolutely no defense against it whatsoever, no medication. They didn't even know how it was being spread. You know, they thought at one point it was either caused by sin, you know, so there were lots of people beating themselves, flagellants beating themselves, thinking that was going to help. And they thought it was caused by the beam of the eyes of a sick person landing on a healthy person. So they had no idea that it was being passed by lice and fleas. And I just wanted to kind of crack open the book at that point and give it a sort of global perspective, because it seems like, you know, it was the disease that defined their era and defined their thinking, I mean, for them, and also previous populaces as well. So I do remember that sense of thinking, okay, I need to sort of, you know, a bit like a film director, pull back the camera to this sort of wide-angled perspective. And I remember, you know, researching how it travelled and looking at the whole Elizabethan trade routes. And I had maps up on my wall of where they dropped off coffee and picked up furs. And, you know, and I had these sort of arrows of the way that the ships had gone. And then, of course, you know, I finished it and then this happened. And I remember last February, whenever it was that we were, you know, watching it come closer and closer, the infographics we were all looking at look exactly the same. And I remember looking on my wall and thinking, oh my God, it's the same thing, you know, it's the same route, it's the same passage. And in a sense, it was caused by the same thing. It's caused by commerce and trade and us, you know, using nature or, you know, exploiting the planet in the same way. It is unfortunately a similar sort of pattern. But I mean, it is strange in a way. You know, I think often when you finish a novel, you know, as soon as you hand it in, send it off to the copy editor or whatever, or to the printers, your relationship with it is sort of gone in a way. It's over. Your relationship with it is set. But with Hamnet, I think it's sort of changed actually, given what's happened in the last year, and sort of continues to do so in a sense. But no, it was strange because I never saw this coming. But I think in a way it's made me realise how fortunate we are actually, because we do know how it's passed, and we do have some medicines, you know, and obviously I know so many people have lost people, and this is not to ignore that, but I think in a sense, you know, there was one particular outbreak of the Black Death, a quarter of the world's population died, and that was just Asia and Europe, because obviously it never reached the Americas. So in a sense it does give a kind of perspective to the suffering that we're undergoing, and at least we have science on our side, and we have, you know, doctors, and we have, I don't know, it does give you a kind of sense of perspective if you look at the virulence and the spread of the Black Death, and what these people had to grapple with, and how terrified they must have been all the time that there would have been an outbreak.
And do you think, because obviously the book had taken, you know, you'd had, like I said, this sort of not percolating, but you know what I mean, you thought about Hamnet a lot. How hard has it been to let go of that when it's been with you for so long? And then, as you just said, it's become more pertinent, I guess, because of the last year.
I mean, it was funny because usually when I finish a novel, I have all around my office, I have all kind of maps and pictures and plans and, you know, sort of flow charts and things. And it does, usually when I finish a book, it takes me maybe a month or two to take them down, but it did take me longer with Hamlet actually. And I did miss him. I missed them, and I missed them quite a bit. So it did take me a while to move on in a way, but I think that's fine. You know, every book has its kind of gestation, and then every book has its, always when you finish a novel, you enter a sort of grieving period in a way, because you have to leave it behind. You know, the novel takes off on a life which doesn't involve you anymore. You know, it takes off on its own and does its own thing, and you're out of the party. So it is strange. But I you know, and actually I still have, you can't see from it, I still have a photograph of the staircase in Henley Street on my pinboard with a kestrel fella, and I think they're always going to be there.
Well, not regarded. And Graham Sillers was actually asking, can you see yourself returning to Elizabethan England again?
I don't know. You never know. I mean, I'm not sure. I feel as though I've told that story I wanted to tell, but never say never.
There's a few questions around film, actually. One is from Sally, who wanted to ask if you steered clear of TV and films about Shakespeare while researching, and also to let you know that she loved the book.
Thank you. I did actually, yes. It's funny, my son started watching, the thing with Ben Elton thing, I can't remember what it's called now. The name's gone. The Ben Elton sitcom about Shakespeare.
Oh, I don't know.
Upstart Crow, that's what it's called.
Oh, that's actually, yes.
So I started watching it, and I actually deliberately, I thought, no, I can't do it, because I needed to kind of, I didn't want that in my head at the same time. So no, I did completely avoid it, and I watched any sort of, I mean, I've seen Shakespeare in Love years ago, whenever it was, 20 or so years ago when it came out. I haven't seen it since, but no, I was quite careful. I really did ring fence myself, because I thought, no, I have to, because obviously everyone's got their own version of Shakespeare in their head, and I just thought that one would be different, and I didn't want it to affect mine. So no, I did.
Joe Burrows asked, are there any plans for a TV or film adaptation? And actually, I do think it's a very cinematic book, not just with the chapter that we've mentioned about the plague, or actually there's one which follows a letter, which I loved as well. It was so beautifully done. But are there any plans? And have you got any kind of ideas of who you might like to play?
Well, I have to say, yes, so the film rights sold before it came out, actually, and it was going to be a BBC, but then I'm actually not allowed to say. So there are other plans, that's all I can say, and it might be coming clear, it might be plumbing clear in the next couple of weeks or months, but yes, I'm afraid I can't say. I've actually been sworn to secrecy, but yeah, it's quite exciting.
We'll have a teaser. We like a teaser.
I know, I'm sorry. If it were up to me, I would tell you, but I'm really not allowed to.
Actually, Jane Nelson just mentioned, and Derbyshire Libraries, who were doing this event with Libraries Connected, is very near Eyam. Have you ever been to Eyam? Because that was one of the few places that got the Black Death outside of.
No, I haven't, and I really want to come, because when I you know, it's funny, I had this conversation because when I was a child, I read a book about Eyam. Was probably when I was maybe 10 or 11 or 12. I read sort of young, I suppose these days it would be called a young adult book about Eyam, and I absolutely loved it. And while I was writing Hamnet, I kept texting friends of mine who were about the same age as me, saying, do you remember a book that was about Eyam? Can you remember? And I had a friend who, and then it turns out yes, and then finally, a friend who's also a real bibliophile said to me, yes, it's by Jill Patton Walsh, and it's called Parcel
of Patchwork, or the Patchwork Parcel.
Something like that. It's absolutely brilliant. And I was so excited, and it's totally out of print, so I had to go on this kind of weird route, and I found it, and I read it again. God, it's really good. But no, I would love to go to Eyam. I really would, and I've never been, but it's such, all these years, you know, whatever it is, 30, 40, is it 40? No, almost 40 years later, I still have such a clear memory of that book. And actually, Geraldine Brooks has written a really brilliant book about it recently, which I only read recently because someone said to me, oh, there's a kind of adult novel. Yeah. Adult novel sounds wrong. Grown-up novel.
One of those places where when you go, and because I'm from Matlock Bath, which is like 6 villages along or whatever, probably more, but it is the place where you go and you can just feel history around you. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. So definitely worth a trip.
Yes,
we could do a vlog there, Maggie. That's what we'll do. We'll go and do a vlog of a plague town.
I love that. I'm definitely up for that, Simon.
So penultimately, early on actually we had a question which is around who the authors that you really love at the moment are and what attracts you to their work.
That's a really big question. Well, at the moment I am rereading Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet, because I read it, I can't remember, I read it when it first came out, whenever that was, 4 or 5 years ago. And I suddenly thought, oh, I really want to read them again. And it is absolutely perfect for the moment because I feel terribly landlocked. And I'm really missing to be able to go. So it's just amazing to spend all this time in Naples and by the sea and then in the city. And so they are just, I don't know, they're so brilliant, those books. There's not a word out of place. So I've loved reading those. I've also reading, it's funny, I've reread a lot of series. So I reread the Cadillets. I think the kind of lockdown just lends itself to reading these. And I also have read Jane Gardam's The Old Filth trilogy, which I absolutely loved. And it's so fantastic when you read the first one of a trilogy and you think, fantastic, there are 2 more to go. I really love those books because they span the stretch of the 20th century, and they're about 3 characters and they follow their lives and their interactions. And obviously they get, it being the 20th century, they go through an awful lot, the wars, and one of them is a Raj orphan, so he's sent from India, no, Malaya actually, all the way to Britain. So they're just fantastic things to lose themselves in. I also really loved a debut novel by Sherry Jones, which is called The One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, which is about Barbados. It's fantastic. It's very quietly experimental, and it sort of focuses on a group of people, and they're all connected by this murder. It's great. And again, that's wonderful sort of armchair travel.
And could possibly be the next Women's Prize winner.
Yes, I know. I've got my fingers crossed actually for that. I know that'd be quite exciting.
That's going to be quite interesting to see how are you feeling about who gets that next?
Exciting to see who the next one's going to be. It's always something, you know, the short list of the Women's Prize is always something that really directs my reading. You know, I always make sure I read at least the short list, if not the long list as well, because it's always interesting books, isn't it? It's always a very cool gang.
It is. And a final question before we get, and this is one that we got a lot, which is, and I know what the answer is going to be to this, but what are you working on next, and can you tell us about it?
Now you know this, Simon, don't you? Unfortunately, I can't. I just have I have a rule that I can never talk about something that I haven't finished, just because I always think that if I talk about it, it's going to drain me of the desire to write it. So I can say that I'm about 3/4 of the way through a new novel. And it's been slightly slowed down by a year of homeschooling, put it that way. And this morning I actually woke up quite early at 6 a.m. because obviously it's school holidays at the moment. And I woke up my husband because I was dining before my kids woke up. So it's happening slowly but surely against many odds. But that's all I can really say. I'm sorry.
And you have been writing some of it in a Wendy house, not a doll's house, as I got very confused with the other day.
That still makes me laugh. Yes, that was something I did. So my husband and I were kind of, taking in turns to homeschool, and it was his turn to homeschool. But I had people coming in, they needed their pencil cases and jam jars, and they would constantly come in out of my study. So, as Simon said, I took my laptop and I hid in my youngest daughter's Wendy house. So it was probably really bad for my back because I was crouched up, but it had my laptop on my knee. But it was fantastic because nobody found me for about 2 hours. I'd recommend if anyone needs a bit of peace and quiet, buy a Wendy house.
Yeah, the Wendy house. And I have to say, sorry, I did say that was the final question, but how excited are you to get back to libraries when they reopen to get researching? Because we couldn't have a libraries event without talking about how brilliant libraries are.
I love libraries. I mean, libraries were just the mainstay of my childhood. I'm old enough to have those original kind of cardboard, really soft library cards that used to take the little things in and out, and I just love the whole ritual of it. And I used to go every week and I'd take 3 books out, and then I'd come back and I'd take 3 more. So I can't wait for libraries to be open. And I've got a stack of books that I took out over a year ago, which seems really odd, and every time I walk past them on the stairs I think, those are really overdue. So no, I can't wait. I'm counting the days till the libraries open their doors.
Well, let's hope that you're not having to use some of the women's win on a library fine. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much for joining us, Maggie. It's been
my pleasure.
And hopefully you'll be out and about in libraries soon. But
yes.
Thank you very much. And if you haven't borrowed or bought Hamnet, get your mitts on it now, as well as Maggie's incredible backlist. But thank you on behalf of Libraries Connected, Derbyshire Libraries, BBC Arts and Arts Council of England. It's been a real pleasure. We will see you very soon. Bye.
Thank you so much.